Thank you very much for having me back, and thank you everybody for joining. Let me share the slides here. So, we're going to be talking about the psychedelic industry's entity dilemma. Very briefly, in terms of introducing myself, I'm the founder of the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, which is an NGO I founded 3 years ago to learn more about post-psychedelic difficulties that people experience and what helps people recover from those difficulties. I'm also the editor of a Substack called Ecstatic Integration, which covers, I've done many stories and kind of articles about issues around psychedelic safety, psychedelic ethics, post-psychedelic difficulties, so that it's now quite a big resource. By the by, I've kind of made a kind of offer for people, attendees here. If you want to sign up, you can get 20% off with that link, just /Finland. And I'm the author of various books, including a cultural history of ecstatic experiences, that's called The Art of Losing Control, and a compendium of people's accounts of their psycho-spiritual emergencies, that's called Breaking Open. So I come from a medical humanities background. I worked at the University of London in their Medical Humanities Centre. And that's useful when considering things like entities, because they can be considered from a historical, theological, phenomenological, or neurobiological perspective. So, what do I mean by the entity dilemma? Well, there are great hopes for psychedelics as the future of mental health. Big Pharma is beginning to place bets on it. Ketamine is already a multi-billion industry. Um, But people quite often encounter entities on psychedelics, beings, aliens, angels, demons, elves, fairies, and so on. These entities can be experienced as friendly or as unfriendly, as healing or as harmful. And that's a bit of a challenge for the normalization and mainstreaming of psychedelics into Western culture and Western healthcare, because we live largely in a secular framework, particularly in terms of our medical system, which is purged of the supernatural and of angels, demons, etc. And so, one of the aspects of the entity dilemma is whether the psychedelic industry should talk about entities or not. If they do talk about entity encounters, it could make psychedelics look weird and woo-woo, threatening the industry's normalization and mainstreaming in Western healthcare. It also threatens their acceptance by Christians and Muslims if they have a very negative attitude towards entities and spirits and might see them as demonic. But if the industry doesn't talk about entities, then what happens if clients take psychedelic medicine and then have an entity encounter and are shocked by it or terrified by it and don't know how to make sense of the encounter? There could be issues there around informed consent. They could go back to the clinic or the guide and say, well, you didn't tell me anything about entities. So what exactly should one teach therapists or guides re-entities? There's also a question around there's now like 150 or more psychedelic training programs, training guides, training psychedelic therapists. What, if anything, should they teach people about entities, about what they are, about how you should engage with them? So these are not easy questions. Let me make a positional statement right from the start. You will all have your own experiences around entities. Maybe you've had encounters with them yourself. Your own preferred interpretation of them, how you make sense of them. Do you see them as just a projection of the mind? Do you see them as something independent and real? And you'll probably have your own theology of them, what they are, how to deal with them, the best kind of way to engage with these kinds of things, and your own professional ethics around them. Should one discuss such matters at all in psychedelic work? And if so, how? My own stance is agnostic. I don't know if such entities are real in the same way as you and I are real, i.e., independent, sentient, temporary, or possibly eternal autonomous beings. But I do know that people have entity experiences, and these can be studied academically. So we're going to look at three kind of sections to my talk over the next hour or so, and then I'm going to, leave plenty of room for your own questions and discussions. First of all, I'm going to offer a brief history of entities in Western culture, how they were, the role that they played, how they were rather banished and marginalized, and their return today. Secondly, we're going to look at entities in psychedelic culture and in psychedelic medicine and different kind of attitudes and perspectives within psychedelic research and within psychedelic culture towards entities. And then finally, I'm going to present some case studies of entity encounters on psychedelics that I've come across in my work. You give me 1 second, I need to let my puppy out of the room because it's kind of putting me off. Wait a second. Come on, Rufus. Out you go. There you go. All right. So first of all, a brief history of entities in Western culture. So most cultures at most times are animist. Um, Humans have usually believed that, in the words of the Greek philosopher Thales, everything is full of God. Rivers, forests, mountains, the sun, the sky, that when we die, our spirit leaves our body and maybe hangs around for a while, that there is a spirit in everything. Um, that might be called demons or angels or jinns or fairies or trolls or duendes or gnomes. There's many different types of spirits according to different cultures. And that was how humans used to, and still often do, make sense of the natural world by ascribing intentionality to natural processes. What's the point of this belief in spirits, fairies, demons, angels, and so on? Well, in the phrase of one historian of fairies called Francis Young, he calls them godlings. So these are like God, but they are closer to the world of humans than, if you believe in an omnipotent God that created the universe, that's quite a distant idea. Whilst spirits are closer to the world of humans, and they're more likely to intervene in human affairs for good or ill. And because they're closer to us, they are more open to petition or supplication. We can try to influence the spirit world, influence kind of fairies or river spirits or plant spirits and so on. And they often offer an explanation for the inexplicable and a mechanism for change or for healing or for improvement in your life in some way. For example, let's say someone in the family is behaving unusually, and you might come up in your culture with the interpretation, oh, maybe they're possessed by a spirit. That's quite common in many cultures still. And that gives, an explanation and a theory for change. We'll go to the witch doctor and they'll do some kind of exorcism ritual, and then our family member will be better and kind of return to normal functioning. So, how do spirit entities supposedly affect human affairs? There's lots of different ways if you consult kind of the folklore or mythology or religions of different cultures. They can grant sickness or they can bring healing. They can bring good luck, they can bring bad luck. They can bring fertility or barrenness, good luck in hunting or bad luck, success or failure in war. They can also bring creative inspiration, if you think about the muses in ancient Greek culture, or prophecy or divination, but they can also bring madness. So there was a sense in older traditional cultures that human life and human society is quite dependent on this supernatural realm, on the realm of the spirits, and can affect our lives in good or bad ways. But the world of fairies and spirits, according to different folklores and mythologies, it has its own rules, its own consequences, but these are somewhat unclear and unpredictable to humans. So humans are trying to kind of live in harmony with the spirit world, but it's rather unpredictable and unclear. So I interviewed Dr. Francis Young, who's written various kinds of histories of the fairy world in Western culture. And he said the recurring and terrifying theme within fairy narratives is the fact that they have these rules, but we don't fully understand what those rules are. And therefore, you can very easily offend them, cross that line without realizing it, and end up in a very bad place. Another common theme of Western fairy stories is if you accidentally offend the world of spirits, they can be brutal in their retribution and in their punishment. And it can seem like, this is not the world of kind of the liberal legal system. The punishments can often far outstrip the offense. And I wonder if that can sometimes be true with psychedelic spirits as well. So, in my interviews with people that have had very bad psychedelic experiences, they sometimes say, I'd taken mushrooms many times and I had a great relationship with, with the mushroom spirit, or I had a great relationship with the ayahuasca spirit. And then suddenly I had this awful experience that left me feeling shattered for months. Come away from those kinds of hellish experiences thinking, you know, why did the mushroom spirit or the ayahuasca spirit treat me in that way? Well, according to Western folklore, the world of spirits can be rather unpredictable and can be rather fickle. So there is a kind of health risk to humans' dealings with the world of spirits, according to folklore. According to European folklore, spirit entities often cause harm, bad luck, illness, or death to adults, children, crops, or livestock. According to some kind of European folklore, they can harm you by firing elf shot arrows at you, much as Amazon shamans fire magic darts at their enemies. They may decide to abduct you to one of their fairy balls, which, like a psychedelic experience, stretch time. So here's an account from one Western, fairy story. Two young men once called in at a fairy house where there was a party going on. One danced away and took a drink, while the other tired of waiting for him and left. When the second man visited the house exactly 1 year later, his friend was still dancing away and on leaving did not realize that a year had passed. Any encroachment into fairyland, intentional or accidental, was highly perilous, according to Western folklore. Once there, it was very difficult to leave, even if the hapless wanderer followed the well-known rules for surviving fairyland. Don't eat or drink, don't speak, don't accept gifts, and was able or allowed to escape. They might find themselves the victim of time distortion. One night in fairyland could amount to years in the mortal realm. And again, this reminds me, these old Western folk tales, there's a kind of echo I find in accounts of people really struggling after psychedelics, people who feel completely dissociated or as if they didn't properly return from the trip, as if they were still somewhat kind of stuck in the world of the trip and unable to come back to kind of home. So, what traditional cultures did, feeling like they were surrounded by this world of spirits who could be terrifying and could be helpful or harmful, is they sometimes had experts in spirits entities, shamans, witch doctors, and their job was to mediate with the unpredictable and rather terrifying world of entities. They might be called the shaman or the witch doctor or the fairy doctor or cunning folk or exorcists or jinn healers and so on. Simon Young, who's another famous folklorist at the moment, he said, this is a pattern that repeats itself throughout Europe. When you have these strong social supernatural systems, you have local magical practitioners who base their reputation and their power on the idea that they can slip into an ecstatic state and communicate with the fairies. Such figures supposedly have one foot in the spirit world themselves, and that makes them suspect and potentially dangerous figures. If you can heal, you can also harm. But if someone, say a loved one, you suspect that they maybe have become possessed by a spirit or cursed by spirits, or somehow they've offended the spirits, you would go to the local shaman, the local curandero, the local fairy doctor, and they would do a consultation. They would maybe go into a trance, possibly psychedelic induced or not. And they could diagnose your loved one and say, okay, this is what they did wrong. They encroached on this fairyland, or they were cursed by an enemy, or something like that. And this is what they need to do, or I can do a ritual and cure them, and so on. But these figures in European cultural history were sometimes also shysters and grifters who preyed on the gullibility of their clients and said, okay, you give me lots of money and I can, set you up for, say, a night with the Queen of the Fairies, for example. So there were actual legal cases in European history of people who were taken to court or accused of basically kind of bullshitting their clients and preying on their gullibility. And again, there may be some similarities there to New Age culture. So the high point of belief in fairies in European culture was in the Middle Ages, let's say around the kind of 12th century or so. Why then did belief in fairies and in kind of natural spirit entities start to decline? Well, it was a complex and very extended story. And of course, belief in entities hasn't disappeared altogether. But one reason for the decline in the belief in kind of spirit entities and natural spirits was the replacement of paganism with Christianity. This is a quote from the English poet Chaucer. All was this land fulfilled with fairies. The elf queen with her jolly company danced often in many a green mead. But now no man can see elves any more, for now the great charity and prayers of holy friars search every land and stream. This means there are no fairies. So according to Chaucer, according to this poem anyway, it was all the activity of Christian vicars and friars and monks and all their prayers, and the fairies didn't like that, so they retreated from these lands. And then the Enlightenment further banished entities or reduced belief in things like fairies and spirits and ghosts and so on. They became seen progressively from the 18th century or the 17th century onwards as really fairy tales, something more, that was banished to children's stories, to folk tales, and only children and the uneducated people in the countryside genuinely believe in these kinds of stories and are frightened by things like spirits or trolls. Educated, urban, male, rational, enlightened people, they wouldn't believe in such things. That was really for children or for non-Europeans or for women. So it was quite a kind of, gendered critique of belief in entities. This, by the way, is a picture by Goya, the Enlightenment artist, and it's called "The Sleep of Reason Produces Monsters." So this idea is when your rationality is turned off, you start believing in goblins and ghouls and ghosts. But with the light of reason, you can understand that that's all just nonsense, it's all just fairy tales, and that natural processes can be explained through kind of physics, through biology, as secular naturalistic occurrences. So from the 17th century onwards, through the scientific revolution, through the Enlightenment, Europeans are increasingly looking for naturalistic explanations of phenomena. And they see supernatural explanations of phenomena as kind of lazy, superstitious, irrational thinking. So, in the theory of Charles Taylor, the philosopher who wrote this wonderful book called The Secular Age, the global north moved from an animist to a secular worldview. And in the animist worldview, we have this idea of that we are a porous self. What do I mean by porous? Well, what does Charles Taylor mean? Porous means that spirits can come into it for good or bad. You could bring in the Holy Spirit or angels or guides or benevolent spirits and become kind of superpowered. This is in the old animist worldview. You could find healing or inspiration or creativity and so on. But you could also become possessed or cursed by negative spirits, malevolent spirits, and become sick or mad, or you could die and so on. So that's the old worldview, the porous self, where things can easily invade yourself. But in the modern secular worldview, we have what Charles Taylor called a buffered self. There are no spirits out there in nature. There's no demons or angels, and there's just your buffered self. If something goes wrong, if you become mad or sick, it's not because spirits came into you. Maybe it's because germs or viruses, or it's some kind of mental disorder or some failure of your own moral self. So there's much more of an emphasis on individual responsibility in the buffered self, and different kind of explanations of mental illness. In the animist worldview, spirit possession is one of the main causes of mental illness. So still today in Mozambique, for example, almost 20% of the population report an experience of spirit possession. Whilst in the secular worldview, we're more likely to talk about mental illness. So, secular psychology and secular psychiatry arose in the 18th and 19th and 20th centuries, offering naturalistic explanations of mental illness to try and help people manage the buffered self and to deal with their inner demons. So, in the words of Carl Jung, the gods have become diseases. So the DSM, you can think of it as a kind of secular book of demonology. The ancient Greeks talked about the god of fear, Phobos, whilst we modern secular Westerners talk about phobia. The ancient Greeks talked about Narcissus, whilst we talk about narcissism as a kind of secular disorder. The ancient Greeks talked about Pan, the kind of god of one of the gods of the natural world, and we talk about panic. The ancient Greeks talked about mania, like when you get mania, it's because you've become possessed by divine madness, whilst we talk about manic disorder. So we have secularized some of these ancient folkloric and mythological concepts. But you can see that it's still quite common to believe in angels, demons, fairies, ghosts, and so on. The global average is slightly less than 50% of the population believe in spirits and entities. But you can see in some countries like South Africa here, it's 75% of the population do. Turkey at 72, Colombia at 68%, Brazil at 67%. So in some countries, particularly in Africa, in the Middle East, and in Latin America, it's still quite common. Likewise, in the United States, which of course is a very Christian country still, it's more common. But then you look at the bottom of this scale, and it's particularly European countries where it's only a third or a quarter of the population who still believe in spirits. So Europe is the most secularized kind of continent in terms of belief in entities. But you can also see some generational differences. So Gen Z is actually at the moment much more likely to believe in spirits and entities than baby boomers, particularly in European countries. So 21% more likely to believe in entities. So that's interesting why that might be. The revival of interest in occultism, in New Age culture, and so on. So you see, shamanism is the fastest growing religion in the UK with younger people. And it's also returning to fashion in South Korea, by the by. This I came across this morning. It made me laugh. This is a reality love show involving shamans in South Korea. So it's called Possessed Love. So that it's become kind of fashionable in Gen Z and among millennials to be interested in entities, in occultism, and so on. And some subcultures still believe in entities and in spirits and so on more than the mainstream. So, charismatic Christianity, Pentecostal Christianity, there is more of a belief in angels and demons. So, that's particularly true in the United States, where charismatic Christianity is very popular. Charismatic Christianity, by the way, is a kind of form of Christianity. It's a bit like Pentecostalism, Neo-Pentecostalism, where you believe in the Holy Spirit and in demons and in kind of miracles, and you believe that the supernatural very much impinges on everyday life. Some forms of Islam believe a lot in jinns and in jinn possession, particularly in North Africa. And then New Age spirituality and occultism and psychedelic culture, there's much more belief in entities than in mainstream culture. So there's quite a difference between psychedelic culture and mainstream Western culture in terms of to what extent people believe in entities. There are also some forms of Western therapy and healing which incorporate the idea of entities and exorcism, like spirit release therapy, which was quite popular in the 80s, Scientology, which is a kind of, cult which where exorcism plays quite a role, and also internal family systems, which is a type of therapy some of you may have come across, and I'll talk more about that shortly. Okay, so part two of my talk is looking at the idea of entities in psychedelic culture and therapy and some of the different attitudes and perspectives one can find within psychedelic culture and within psychedelic science. So, entity encounters are quite common on psychedelics. A 2015 survey of 800 psychonauts by Fontainglou et Frémosser found that 46% of ayahuasca takers reported encounters with superhuman or spiritual entities, as well as 36% of DMT takers, 17% of LSD takers, and 12% of psilocybin takers. So that's really interesting right off the bat. That that some substances or some contexts seem to lead to more entity encounters than others. So ayahuasca and DMT seem to lead to it's more likely you're going to have an entity encounter than on LSD or in psilocybin. They didn't have figures for ketamine, but I would think that there was, sometimes people report entity encounters on ketamine, but it depends on the dose, and it's somewhat less likely. Um, this sort of entity encounter is typically a positive experience, but not always. In a Johns Hopkins survey by Davis and al. In 2020 of 2,561 people, no, actually, this was a survey, all 2,561 people in the survey said they'd encountered entities under the influence of DMT. And then the survey asked them about this entity encounter. They usually described these entities as a guide or helper, but 11% described the entity as a demon, devil, or monster. For 78% of people in this survey, the entities were experienced as benevolent or sacred, but a minority said they felt negatively judgmental, and 11% felt they were malicious. So on the whole, people seem to be on DMT encountering, having benevolent kind of encounters with entities. Most now, what do people think of these entities they encounter? Do they think they are projections of their subconscious, archetypes, or do they think these are real? What does that mean by real? Kind of independently existing, not just a projection of their own mind, not just a subjective imagination. So, in the Johns Hopkins survey of people smoking DMT, 72% thought the entity continued to exist after their encounter, and 80% said the experience altered their fundamental conception of reality. The number of respondents who identified as atheist fell from 28% before the encounter to 10% after. So people are coming away from these experiences, um, and their model of reality has changed. They've come away, on the whole, convinced that these kinds of entities are real, at least kind of, real like you and me, like independently existing, sentient, autonomous beings. Encounters with both positive and negative entities are particularly common on ayahuasca. In Busso and al.'s 2022 paper on adverse ayahuasca events, which used data from the 11,000 respondent global ayahuasca survey, 15% reported feeling energetically attacked or a harmful connection to the spirit world. So, another way to put that is about 50% of people who take ayahuasca report encountering different types of entities. Most find that a positive and benevolent experience, but sometimes people feel they encounter some kind of negative entity and they come away feeling harmed from it. So, why would psychedelics lead to this experience of entity encounters? I mean, there hasn't been much published on this yet. There haven't been many researchers trying to say, well, why are these kinds of entity encounters happening? What might be going on? But here are some potential reasons why. And I'm sure you have your own theories too. One could be that psychedelics enhance a person's imagination or fantasy so that they see things that aren't there, but which seem very real. Another could be that psychedelics open the unconscious and allow experiences or archetypes or ideas to appear to a person as an external being, so that the entities you encounter could be the embodiment of a certain idea or maybe an experience from your life or some kind of archetype, either from your subconscious or from the Jungian collective unconscious, and it appears as a being to you. Or perhaps psychedelics increase some kind of anthropomorphizing tendency, some kind of so that we ascribe intentionality to things. So we don't just see a river or a cloud, but it looks like a being to us. We don't just see the sun, but it looks like some kind of living being, or the river, or so on. I mean, often people on psychedelics, they say things like, oh, it looked like the walls were breathing, for example. So there's an ascribing, an anthropomorphizing, or an ascribing of intentionality and of sentience to kind of your environment. Perhaps psychedelics return us to an earlier animist stage of consciousness where it seems like everything is full of gods. But maybe that's a potentially racist theory to say, well, animism is an earlier stage of human consciousness, but we've now developed beyond it. Now we're more advanced. But I mean, that is a potential theory. Or maybe psychedelics genuinely open us to a spirit realm which independently exists and is brimming with entities, harmful and helpful, malevolent and benevolent, and so on. So that's also a possibility. So there are all these kind of multiple possibilities. And I'm sure there are other theories as well, perhaps neurobiological ones about why it should do something to the brain and lead to these kinds of entity encounters. And another one that I think I should mention here is that psychedelics amplify your cultural context. And maybe that's why ayahuasca particularly leads to these kinds of entity encounters, because people are taking ayahuasca within the context of Amazon shamanism, and within a context that very much puts forward a belief in spirits as a kind of explanatory framework. And so if you go to the Amazon and you go to an ayahuasca retreat, and everyone there is talking about Mama Ayahuasca, and the shamans are talking about the plant spirits, and you then take a psychedelic drug, you are more likely to have a psychedelic experience informed by that cultural setting. So that's another potential theory. On the other hand, people might be smoking DMT, and that's not really within that cultural setting. But by now, DMT culture does talk a lot about elves and machine elves and so on. So it can be hard to pick apart the influence of setting and of expectation and the influence of just the substance itself. So I did a survey of 129 people who work in the psychedelic industry: guides, therapists, psychiatrists, shamans, chaplains, and some just kind of psychonaut explorers. And I asked the people, do you believe in the existence of spirits, entities, non-human intelligences that one can encounter on psychedelics? And you can see that 70% of people in psychedelic culture and industry do believe in the existence of spirits, entities, and non-human intelligences. So that is more than the kind of 50% or so of the general population. So psychedelic culture seems to believe in existence of spirits more than the mainstream population of Western countries. I asked, do you believe in malevolent spirits or entities which can attach themselves to people? Fewer people in psychedelic culture and industry believe in malevolent spirits, but still a majority do. I asked, do you think psychedelics open us up to the spirit world in good ways and bad? And yes, 70% of people believe that psychedelics make us more porous. They take us back to being a porous self. And when we're in the psychedelic state and our ego has dissolved and our rationality is turned off and we are opened up, and the spirit world can come into us in good ways and bad. Now, in Amazon shamanism, of course, one of the central roles of the shaman is to bring good spirits into the ceremony for healing purposes or divination, and to protect the client from malevolent or harmful spirits. That's one of the shaman's key roles. They hold the space. They bring the good spirits in, they keep the bad spirits or the malevolent spirits out. So, is that something that Western psychedelic therapists or guides should consider? Is that something they should learn? If so, how exactly do we learn that? I asked people, do you think people working with psychedelics should be trained in how to engage with the spirit world? And 60% of people in psychedelic industry or psychedelic research or psychedelic culture thought, yes, people working with psychedelics should be trained in how to engage with the spirit world. And then I asked, do you feel yourself qualified and trained to engage with the spirit world? And fewer than 40% felt they were. So there's a bit of a gap there between how psychedelic culture and industry, would like to be prepared for working with psychedelics and how they actually feel prepared. Westerners in this field don't really feel qualified to deal with the spirit world. And frankly, I don't blame them because it's hard to understand that world or to know it. Um, so what does psychedelic science say about entities and how to engage with them? What could one be taught about entities and how to engage with them? Well, at the moment, psychedelic research doesn't say a great deal about it. Aldous Huxley, Timothy Leary, Ram Dass, Stanislav Grof, some of these kinds of, you know, elder figures of psychedelic research, there's not a great deal of mention of entities in their work. I mean, Timothy Leary in the 70s did talk about it a bit, but not a great deal. Stanislav Grof, tell me if I'm wrong, but I think he did talk about things like cosmic consciousness, but I haven't come across so much about entities in his work. Tell me if I'm wrong, or tell me where one can find it, perhaps. Certainly, if you look at the kind of first generation of Westerners exploring psychedelics in the late 19th and early 20th century, you could say that Aleister Crowley certainly wrote a lot about entities, angels, demons, etc., and how to use ceremonial magic to control them or repel them. Um, Terence McKenna also talked more about encounters with machine elves on DMT. And I'm not an expert on McKenna, but he seemed to see these machine elves as potentially playing a role in the coming technological singularity. But there's been a growing interest in entities since the 1990s through the rise of ayahuasca, but more in kind of plant medicine culture and less in the world of academic psychedelic science. And the reason for that is it's really frowned upon to talk about spirits in the world of academic science. The rules of academic science are naturalistic. So you can talk about spirits in terms of the phenomenology of people's entity encounters. You can study that, and anthropologists do. But, in terms of discussing whether there really is something, you know, to the spirit world, that is not really accepted in the world of academic science, and it's not really accepted in the world of pharmaceutical research. As a result, on the whole, the world of academic science, and on the whole, the world of psychedelic medicine and the world of clinical trials has pretty much ignored the whole, entity question. I would imagine hardly any clinical trials would mention entities in informed consent to trial participants. Um, and I would think that most clinical trial therapeutic handbooks would also just simply not mention entities at all. So that whole topic, which is right at the heart of indigenous shamanism, is left out really of Western psychedelic science. And people will pay respect to indigenous wisdom and say, oh, they've been doing psychedelics for thousands of years. There's so much to learn from it. But on the whole, that whole aspect of psychedelics in indigenous culture is somewhat left out of, or actually largely or even completely left out of Western academic psychedelic science. Um, However, there are some projects now. There's like a project of extended DMT research, which is about trying to map the DMT space, trying to have extended conversations with DMT entities. So that's happening. There's also the DMT entity conferences organized by my colleague David Luke, who also works at the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences Project, and he's produced a lot of research about entity encounters. And there are some others who are also, doing some research on entity encounters, but it's still not really very central. But you do see, some leading psychedelic researchers have expressed opinions on the topic of entities. So this is Bill Richards, who is a very influential figure in the psychedelic Renaissance. Was the lead therapist at Johns Hopkins in some of its, foundational trials that Roland Griffiths was the lead investigator for over the last 20 years. And before that, he also was working with Walter Panker, I believe, in psychedelic research in the 70s. And his attitude is basically if you encounter some kind of entity or monster or dragon or demon during your psychedelic experience, you should go towards it and befriend it. He says, in and through is the mantra. If an inner dragon, boogeyman, or monster should reveal itself, then we go straight towards it as rapidly as possible and say, well, hello, aren't you big and scary? What can I learn from you? And so instead of running away and getting into panic and paranoia and confusion, and even perhaps needing to go to a psychiatric emergency room, you look it straight in the eye and you say, boy, you're an ugly part of me, but what are you made of? And when you go towards it, inevitably there's insight. I always say what devils hate most is being embraced. So this is a Jungian attitude. You should recognize and accept your shadow when it arises. And in dreams and in ecstatic experiences, your shadow, what Jung means by a shadow is the rejected or dissociated parts of your psyche, everything that you've kind of tried to bury or dissociate. That can come back in the shape of a monster or some kind of loathsome, repulsive, terrifying being. But to become integrated, to become a whole, mature, self actualized person, you should confront your shadow, recognize it as a part of your psyche, to have compassion for it, and accept and integrate it. Then you become a whole, self actualized being. And it's a similar attitude as one finds in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, which has been an influential text for psychedelic science ever since Leary and Alpert made it the basis of their psychedelic experience manual. So in the Tibetan Book of the Dead, it's a guide for when you die and your soul goes through these bardo states. And after, in these bardo states, sometimes you might encounter terrifying, wrathful deities, monster figures. And according to the Tibetan Book of the Dead, you should recognize these demon figures as an aspect of consciousness, fundamentally empty, lacking in self, and part of the kind of divine emptiness of all things. When you have this insight into the emptiness of these demons, then they dissolve and you pass on towards enlightenment. So, in Tibetan Buddhist theology, any monsters, demons, or wrathful deities you encounter should be recognized as aspects of consciousness, real at the conditioned level, and perhaps deserving of compassion, but empty of self at the ultimate level and transformable through insight. On the right, this is the picture of the Buddha meditating under the Bodhi tree and being assailed by demons. But because the Buddha's reached such a high level of insight, he recognizes these demons all as kind of conditioned beings lacking a fundamental self, and they just dissolve. But there is an alternative view of psychedelic entities, which you can find in the work of Rick Strassman. Strassman, who became famous for his DMT experiments in the 1980s. And in his DMT experiments, people often encountered entities, and sometimes these entities weren't friendly, and people would try to accept them and extend compassion towards them, but the entities still remained kind of sometimes somewhat malevolent. And this was challenging for Strassman, and he's kept thinking about it over the decades since. And he brought out one of his most recent books called, I think it's called DMT and the Soul of Prophecy. in which he talks about taking a Judeo-Christian perspective on psychedelic entities and seeing them as kind of like angels or demons. Some of them can be helpful guides, some of them can be malevolent guides and or malevolent beings. And you really need, therefore, discrimination to know if an entity you encounter is an ally or an enemy, and you need protection if it's an enemy, if it's a hostile entity, to kind of repel it. So this is both quite a Judeo-Christian view and also quite a shamanic view of entities, because shamans have the same kind of perspective. Entities can be healing or harmful, they can be helpful or unhelpful, so you need to know how to deal with them. You can't just say, oh, you're just an aspect of my consciousness. So Strassman, in an interview I did with him, said, bad trips happen and it's usually because of frightening content. The last such episode I had like that, I meditated and accepted the content, the kind of Bill Richards approach, and it got worse and worse. Then I started praying to God using some simple Hebrew prayers, and the situation resolved. If one believes in angels, then demons also have a place. The location doesn't matter. These beings represent things about which we were previously unaware or only dimly aware, and then we need to deal with them or the information they convey. So Strassman isn't, I don't think he's totally certain these things are either real demons and angels or aspects of consciousness. But he says either way, we need a better protocol for dealing with them. Now, I want to talk a bit about internal family systems and their idea of entities. So, internal family systems is one of the most popular therapeutic modalities in psychedelic culture. The University of Michigan did a survey of psychedelic guides and therapists, and it asked them what kind of modalities they used. And IFS was the second most popular therapeutic modality, I believe, after somatic therapy. I think that was the most popular, but it's very popular within psychedelic culture. Although there's not a great deal of scientific evidence in terms of peer-reviewed articles for its efficacy. So IFS arose more through the kind of New Age spirituality, Esalen, human potential movement, the coaching movement, and through that kind of world, rather than through kind of mainstream psychotherapy. And the basic idea of IFS is that our psyches are made up of parts. They call them manager parts, firefighters, exiles, like the dissociated parts of us. And these are, according to the founder of IFS, Dick Schwartz, fully formed autonomous beings. And even parts can have parts as well. So you can really be, the psyche can, in the IFS view, is this walking zoo of different parts. And then kind of beyond all these parts, there is what they call the self. So the self is this kind of mystical or kind of Hindu capital S self, of this higher self, this ultimate consciousness, the ground of being in which everything emerges, and that this self is ultimately loving and wise, and we're all made up of it. So Dick Schwartz wrote a book called There Are No Bad Parts. So the IFS theory of change is that we can become aware of our parts, we can become more conscious of them, and we can even dialogue with our parts through a kind of imaginary dialogue or through hypnotic guided dialogue. And we can learn to have compassion for all the parts of us, and that will stop them acting out in destructive ways for our personality. So that's what kind of IFS therapists and coaches do with their clients. They help them to develop a dialogue and a better awareness of their inner parts, and to bring them into the loving, wise energy of self. So IFS also talks about guides, which are kind of these angelic spirits or guardian angels which one can contact. So Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, talks about encountering guides or helpers through his own psychedelic experiences. And one finds a similar idea, by the by, in some forms of Gestalt therapy, which is quite a popular modality in some parts of psychedelic culture. The idea of guides or guardian angels. But it also turns out that in IFS, there are some parts to the psyche which people can sometimes encounter which are not part of them and which are not friendly. And so these are called unattached burdens. And a book by a leading IFS practitioner called Robert Falconer came out about unattached burdens recently, called The Others Within Us, with a foreword by the founder of IFS, Dick Schwartz. So what Bob Falconer says is that there are these things one can encounter within you called unattached burdens. These are entities which are not part of you and which wish you ill. They can appear demonic in dreams or psychedelic experiences or in kind of guided hypnotic IFS sessions. It's unclear where they came from. I asked Bob Falconer, what are these unattached burdens? He suggested they could be restless ghosts, they could be malevolent spirit beings, but he wasn't entirely sure. But supposedly, if you encounter one of these malevolent beings that really wish you were dead, you can exercise them quite easily, according to IFS. You simply tell them that you want them to leave, and if you do genuinely wish them to leave, then they have to leave you, apparently, according to Robert Falconer. So Falconer and, in IFS culture, there's this idea that psychedelics can open us up to unattached burdens. Here's what Falconer told me. We're more vulnerable and open to spiritual influence of any kind, good and bad, on psychedelics. Before speaking to you, I did a very dramatic session with a young woman. She went to an ayahuasca ceremony, and group medicine is more prone to have these things get into people. She got something in her and knew something was wrong. She left the place and she had an acute psychotic episode and was hospitalized against her will. So anyway, this woman eventually comes to Bob Falconer, and he, in his IFS sessions, claims he could exercise this unattached burden from this person. He claims that IFS exorcism of unattached burdens is easy. He tells the UB to go into the light and coaxes the client to ask the UB to leave. He says that as long as no part of the person is afraid or attached to the UB has no choice but to leave. So, here's one of my questions for the seminar. Is there a risk of ISS or of other psychedelic modalities that believe in spirit entities implanting or suggesting the idea of a malevolent entity into a client? And if so, what are the ethics of that? Do you get my point? Is there a risk of, someone being in IFS therapy or some other kind of psychedelic therapy and basically being told you have an entity within you, you have a demon within you, and that not being helpful for the person? I mean, could that potentially be distressing or confusing or bewildering to the client? Well, I did find examples, several examples of IFS clients being suggested or told that they had an unattached burden within them. So here's one example. I've been doing IFS with a very seasoned practitioner for 2 years. I've been stagnant and feeling deeply depressed despite no obvious cause. I've sensed for a while a part inside me that isn't my own. My therapist recommended I read the Robert Falconer book, and last week we uncovered an unattached burden. So there, the therapist seems to have actively suggested that the client has an unattached burden within them. Here's another example. I've had something come up where it didn't feel like me, and I thought it belonged to my mum. I did a legacy burden workshop and had another IFS student walk me through dealing with the part, but it wouldn't be pinned down and wouldn't answer any questions. It was like some sort of cage thrashing animal. I wasn't sure if it was the legacy burden or maybe a UB. I did a course with Bob Falconer, and one of the exercises to meet our guides, we walk along a path. As I started to go up, I was met by this sort of cloud dragon part that had red eyes. Bob had said one of the tells of a UB is red eyes. I had a session with Bob and asked this thing if it was part of me, and it said no. So I unburdened. Of course, I feel crazy for mentioning and talking about this, but deep down, I know I have had quite a few experiences in life that I can't explain. So this person was again, it was suggested to them they had a UB within them, though, it sounds like they found the session with Bob Falconer helpful. The exorcism seems to have been helpful in this case. Here's another example. I had a therapist try to explain it to me, and honestly, it freaked me out. His explanation was basically that some malevolent spirit had got into people and tortures them. It made me think of The Exorcist. My cynical part thinks this concept was Dick Schwartz basically saying, well, if none of the IFS protocols and strategies work, let's call whatever it is an unattached burden. I don't know what to make of it, honestly. So in that case, this person seems somewhat bewildered and freaked out in their expression by the therapist introducing the idea of an unattached burden. Here's an email I got um, when I started writing about this. I follow your blog and wanted to get in touch regarding IFS. I recently ended therapy with an IFS practitioner because of a sudden introduction to Falconer's ideas into our work and subtle suggestions of ritual abuse. I was shocked and saddened after years of working with this therapist and named it. We tried to work through it, but I ended therapy because it felt that trust had been broken. I really appreciated your post because it echoes exactly my experience, and I worry for clients who are less able to state when a boundary is transgressed. So this person feels shocked and saddened, and that trust had been broken by their IFS therapist or IFS practitioner, introducing the idea of an unattached burden in a sudden and distressing way, and plus subtle suggestion of ritual abuse. Here's another example. I've been seeing my psychologist who specializes in trauma therapy for about 10 months now. I made it clear that I was not interested in anything spiritual because I had a lot of that pressed on me and I wanted to set my boundaries. After our meeting on Tuesday, when I discussed a very frightening embodiment of what I would call the abyss or death, which I felt had its sight set on me, she told me she thought I had an unattached burden. At first, I was interested, thinking it was some kind of trauma thing, and then my heart sank. And then I got really pissed off. I have suffered from delusions in the past. She knows that. I've experienced psychosis in the past. I've been expressing very suicidal thoughts, and I'm in one of the most vulnerable times of my life. I feel disrespected, but more than anything, I feel honestly, it's kind of disgusted with the fact that she could say something so irresponsible to somebody in my situation. So there, the client did not feel this was a helpful suggestion. She felt that this was suggesting a kind of delusion that she has a malevolent entity within her. Is there the risk of another kind of satanic panic, like in the multiple personality disorder boom of the 80s and 90s? During in the 80s and 90s, there was a sudden surge of people receiving the diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. And that was often tied to hypnotherapists recovering or uncovering memories of satanic ritual abuse. And it was very controversial, and there were cases where people ended up suing therapists for they say suggesting the idea of satanic ritual abuse to them. So there can be a risk, a legal risk, if therapists are be seen to implant the idea of things like satanic ritual abuse or of things like demons in clients. And actually, there was a case 15 years ago, somewhere called the Castlewood Eating Disorder Clinic, where two IFS trained therapists faced multiple lawsuits for implanting a belief in satanic ritual abuse and demonic possession in the people who attended this clinic. So you can see the story on the right. A woman claims a psychologist in an eating disorder clinic hypnotized her while she was on psychotropic drugs, inducing false memories of being raped and belonging to a satanic cult. And Dick Schwartz, the founder of IFS, was actually a trainer at that clinic. So there are retreat centers which clearly suggest the idea of demonic possession to clients and attendees. This is a well-known ayahuasca uh, treatment center for people with addiction, and uh, it has a frame, a cultural frame, a setting of kind of a mix of Catholic and indigenous shamanic beliefs, and it's quite well known that it teaches the idea that addiction can be tied up with demonic possession, and you can kind of exorcise the demon of addiction. Um, so it very much suggests that framework to people who attend treatment at this clinic. And it's somewhat mentioned on their website as well. It's mentioned on their website that it has this kind of Catholic framework, but you'd have to ask, is it upfront about its belief in entities and in spirit, and in exorcism? Is there informed consent, or is this explanatory framework kind of foisted on people, imposed on people without their consent when they're in suggestible psychedelic states? That perhaps might be considered unethical. It's fine for a psychedelic retreat center to have an animistic framework. Many psychedelic retreat centers have a setting of spirits and plant spirits or mama ayahuasca and so on, and maybe even of kind of demons. But do they have an ethical responsibility to tell people that they have this setting before they sign up for a retreat, rather than suddenly kind of imposing it on them when they're tripping? Now, I don't know whether Takiwasi Center does tell people in advance, but I think that will be an important question. Okay, so I don't know how I'm doing on time, but hopefully I've got a bit of time left. I hope tell me if there's less than 30 minutes left, because I want to leave plenty of time for questions. But what I want to look at now is just some case studies of psychedelic entity encounters. These are people that I've come across in the research for the Challenging Psychedelic Experiences project, and in my journalism as well for ecstatic integration. So, for example, there's Chloe's story. Chloe was a 37-year-old. She described herself as a nihilist and dominatrix with complex PTSD from a difficult childhood. And her emotional problems got worse during the pandemic. She was living alone in her apartment in London. And she decided, like many people during the pandemic, to go on a healing journey to try and heal her trauma. And in her case, using quite regular psychedelics. She said, I finally started properly healing myself after a lifetime of trying but failing. And it was with psychedelics. It was just me and myself, no therapist, no coach, no mentor, nothing. Just me and a book, Complex PTSD from Surviving to Thriving by Pete Walker, and a bottle of LSD. Starting on June the 29th, 2020, I started doing a 100 microgram trip every week and applying Pete Walker's reparenting technique, which is when you kind of try to identify your inner children and show them love and affection. When I discovered there was more than one inner child, I went down the internal family systems road and decided, right, I'm going to save all my inner children. Eventually, she took what she told me was an 100-gram dose of mushrooms. And when I wrote this, people said, I think that's a typo. Maybe it was like 10 grams, which would still be an incredibly high dose. But Chloe said, no, this was 100 grams of mushrooms. And that's a very, very, very high dose. And she had a kind of what she described as demonic encounter. I felt something inside of me in my ass cheek, anchoring me down to the ground and stopping me from spreading my wings. And it felt like a parasite. I realized it was something spread throughout my body. And my voice was like trying to get rid of it and inject it. I said, "Oh my God, you're a parasite." That moment, it appeared before me in the room, a sort of purple blog. I think that's a misprint, a blob, like a tumor, with all these thin tentacles coming out of it. It was a female demon. At the end of each tentacle was something she used to distract people so she could feed off them: alcohol, partying, porn, Instagram. When I got distracted by the tentacles, she would disappear, but I'd keep track of it and not let her get away. I realized she would dangle these things in front of people and then lay eggs in them. She laid the eggs through people's trauma and then they wound others. It felt like me versus her. And suddenly I was channeling Gaia and the kind of earth spirit. And she was screaming, "Get off my planet." It was like Ripley versus the alien. Chloe felt possessed by this parasite for months. And it was kind of terrifying and alienating. And she did her best to try and purge herself of the demon. And I asked her what helped her to recover. She said finding social support was crucial for Chloe. She went to a spiritual awakening group and sharing circle hosted by the Psychedelic Society in London. Once a month, she would share a bit about her struggle with the demon, who she had nicknamed the Mother, which is sure to delight the Freudians out there. The group did not judge her or pathologize her. She said, "There were a lot of moments when I wondered if I was going mad. But through the spiritual awakening sharing circle, I discovered Stanislav Grof's book on spiritual emergencies, and that helped me." She was talking to a person from the group on the phone one day, and they said something as a joke: "I am the darkness." She says, "That phrase, 'I am the darkness,' just sat with me. I thought, oh my God, this is it. I am the darkness. The darkness is needed for there to be light. It's part of the whole. I've been trying to eject this thing from my body, and what I need to do is what I did with all my child parts, which is when I see something I hate about myself, I embrace it and love it. And so I did the reparenting technique. I see you, and I'm so sorry I rejected you." And the demon was weeping. So Chloe took a Buddhist Jungian attitude to this demon and took pity on it and compassion and insight and recognized it as part of the whole and integrated it. She ended up, in fact, becoming a trainee Buddhist nun last time I spoke to her a year ago. So that's one perspective. That's one story of a kind of negative entity encounter. Here's another story of an entity encounter. This is someone we interviewed for the study of post-psychedelic existential confusion that Irini Argiri wrote and that I worked on, that was published in PLOS One a couple of months ago. So Brian was an 18-year-old Englishman at a university. He was fascinated by esoteric ideas, by Terence McKenna, etc., and by a kind of search for cosmic truth, for hidden truth, and so on. He took 3 grams of mushrooms alone at university in his university room with the intention of breaking through and discovering cosmic truths. Brian had an experience of aliens speaking to him in an alien language. He felt they were revealing to him the secrets of the universe, but he kept on forgetting the secret when he was realizing it. And after this trip, he felt a deep sense of existential confusion and ontological shock lasting for months. He felt, who could I talk to about this experience? it socially disconnected him and alienated him from others because he felt in his small town in England or among his friends that they didn't talk about things like alien encounters. It was simply too weird an experience within the usual mainstream Western culture, and that was disconnecting and alienating for him. He also felt, what's the point of my degree or my future career in a world where aliens exist? It actually undermined his sense of meaning and purpose. So this is interesting, right? That, psychedelics can enhance your feeling of social connection and enhance your sense of cosmic meaning and purpose. But sometimes with these more difficult experiences, they can actually increase your feeling of social disconnection, of isolation, and they can undermine your sense of meaning and purpose. And Brian says he obsessively ruminated on the experience, trying to understand it. This is quite common with post psychedelic ontological shock. People are constantly thinking, what does it mean? How do I make sense of it? What model of reality should I use? Should I use an animist model or some kind of transpersonal or some kind of secular model? And you're constantly just flitting between these models of reality. It's almost a kind of philosophical OCD. Brian, in his case, he recovered by choosing to focus less on such big cosmic mysteries and instead re engaging with his life in the here and now, with his relationships, with his everyday activities, with his university degree, and so on. He took an agnostic perspective, deciding he will never know the answers to these big cosmic questions, and just to stop spending so much time obsessing over them and instead live your life in the here and now. And in fact, he shifted to a less spiritual, less esoteric, and a more empirical and evidence-based worldview. So that's another kind of story. And here is two jinn encounters on psychedelics. This comes from a story I published on ecstatic integration called Islam, Psychedelics, and Jinn Encounters. So first of all, the story of John. Trigger warning, by the way. This involves suicide. This is a tragic story. Um, John was a successful CEO in Canada from a Yemeni Canadian background. He took a lot of psychedelics regularly during the pandemic with his partner. This is what his partner told me. They had lots of good experiences, but they were doing high doses again on their own without guides. And one time on a very high dose, about 8 grams of mushrooms, he had a kind of hell experience. He told me he saw as if he's in hell and it's his judgment day. Everything he's done in his life is being shown to him, and he understands that's his reality now and he'll never get out of hell. He was so terrified, you could see it in his eyes. You cannot deny whatever was installed from his childhood, right? You cannot fully take it away. So, of course, that idea of Judgment Day, the idea of a judging God and spirits or jinns or whatever must have been in there in the background. Jinns, by the way, in Islamic cultures, are these kinds of ambivalent spirit beings. They can sometimes be helpful, but they can also often be kind of harmful as well, and they can sometimes possess you. Unfortunately, John got worse and refused to seek help. That was partly because his coping style was very self-reliant, and he was worried that as an immigrant, if he went to a psychiatrist, he could be sectioned, uh, or he could be, I mean, he was the main provider for his family, or he was worried he could be kicked out of Canada. So he resisted from seeking help, whether that's psychiatric help or spiritual help. He didn't go to an imam, for example, either. He felt he was being attacked by jinns, but he could ward them off by screaming while praying. Natalie recalls hours and hours of screaming. He believed if he didn't scream the prayer properly, the jinns would attack him and attack us too. He said he heard voices in his head threatening people or trying to convince him to harm people. It was so opposite to his normal personality because he's extremely kind and caring, never aggressive. This was a totally different person. The only stable, constant thing about him now was his instability. And eventually, tragically, he took his own life. So, you can see lots of red flags there. High dose, lack of guides, not seeking help when he's in a kind of psychotic state, resisting his loved ones also reaching out for help. And in fact, he continued to do psychedelics when he was in this kind of psychotic state. And so this had the worst possible outcome. Let me give an example of a somewhat similar story. Tal is a 42-year-old counselor of Yemeni Sudanese heritage. She was born in Abu Dhabi, but she also moved to Canada when she was 17. She married a surgeon, also of Muslim heritage, and they have two children who are now teenagers. And Tal tells me since childhood, I would see otherworldly entities that I now recognize as jinns. I remember one time we were in York, England, on a family vacation. I woke up to see a big owl in the middle of the room. I had many experiences like that. So, you know, from a Western psychiatric perspective, you could say that Tal, has a kind of um, maybe a tendency to psychosis, tendency to unusual experiences like spirits or entities happening all the time. But from a kind of non-Western medical perspective, you could say that maybe she had a kind of shamanic or a temperament or a kind of animist healer temperament. And in fact, there is a tradition of that in her heritage. Tal thinks these unusual experiences partly stem from childhood trauma, which made her more porous and prone to liminal states, and partly from her ancestry. I was experiencing what my ancestors probably experienced in a more organized manner. I come from a lineage where, for example, my grandfather would heal people in the village by reading the Quran, and I feel like I inherited some of that. In Canada, once during psychotherapy school, a colleague of mine was not feeling good, and I intuitively laid my hand on his head and read a few verses of the Quran. Then he started throwing up and felt better. So Tal got into psychedelics in her 30s. She began a PhD at CIIS, one of the oldest psychedelic therapy training schools. In 2019, she smoked 5-MeO-DMT, which triggered an extended psychospiritual crisis. I was very open and the downloads were endless. I became very concerned with whether I would burn in hell for not being a good Muslim. I sought out help and met with a traditional Sufi healer from Sudan. He said, "You're one of us. You must come to the Kalwa here with us." That opened up another layer where I was shown everything, ancestors, entities, other things beyond language. I felt like I was dying. While lying beside my husband to sleep one night, I spontaneously said, "Take care of the kids. I think I'm exiting my body." She became paranoid at points. The government is going to get me because they think I'm a terrorist, or the Muslim community is going to get me because I'm a bad Muslim. At times, she also felt suicidal. It felt like not wanting to be in your body, very contractive, and just, I want to be in bed, very intrusive suicidal thoughts. She also felt isolated. Some friends pulled back because it was way too much. Others were very supportive, but I was trying to contain it all and not share too much because I didn't want to burden others with what was coming up. Finally, she was checked into an emergency psychiatric ward 4 times between 2021 and 2022. She has now stabilized. Her advice to others going through psychospiritual emergencies: first of all, make sure that you have a solid support system around you. For family members, just make sure they feel safe, know they're loved, and know everything will be okay. Don't treat them like they're crazy. This is normal. People have been communing with the divine since time immemorial. And if you need therapy or medications, that's okay. I still take a very small dose in emergencies. She also told me that she developed an a framework, a belief framework to integrate these experiences, which combines Western healthcare and Western psychology and psychiatry with a more kind of Sufi and Islamic perspective. She said, I've had a billion psychoses. What holds me together is that I have a solid framework to understand what happened to me because of holding both a Sufi cosmology, which includes things like jinns, and a Western trained counselor perspective. So there are many other, just to conclude finally, and then we'll go to your questions and comments and discussion. There are many other examples I could give from psychedelic culture and industry. I could talk about Santo Daime, which is a kind of ayahuasca syncretistic Christian animist church, which appeared in Brazil and is now spread over the world. And in Santo Daime, sometimes people talk about encountering spirits, guardian angels, the spirits of the dead, and kind of helping them to pass on, to kind of purge them. I could talk about some very dark stories I've come across in my journalism. I wrote about a place called Sawillo, which is a retreat in Mexico, where the founder of the retreat was smoking bufo every day, multiple times. And people who went there, multiple people who went to this retreat felt that they encountered dark spirits, that there were dark spirits around the man running the retreat. They felt they went, people felt they almost lost their minds, they almost took their own lives. And it's that story made me open to the possibility that really reckless psychedelic use really can open people up to dark spirits, which is not really something I have a tendency to believe. But that was one story where I thought this does sound extremely dark, and who knows. But there are also many, many positive stories of entity encounters. People taking ayahuasca and feeling guided by it, feeling like they've learned from it, feeling like they were healed by it. Likewise, people smoking DMT and feeling like they had largely positive encounters with entities. So though I've talked quite a lot about these kinds of negative entity encounters, I just want to reiterate the point that it seems like the vast majority of entity encounters on psychedelics are, people feel they're positive and helpful. In conclusion, we live in increasingly weird times in which there is a growing interest in encounters with non-human intelligences, whether that's through UFO culture, AI, and the idea that, then through AI we might create sentient consciousness, the mainstreaming of psychedelics, the growing popularity of charismatic Christianity. This is all leading to the mainstreaming of beliefs in non-human intelligences, also, or in angels, or in entities, or in demons as well. You see the growing interest in the demonic, particularly in US religion and in US politics. The US Christian right is increasingly demon obsessed. If you look at things like QAnon, or you look at things like the New Apostolic Reformation, which is this charismatic Christian movement, which was quite connected to the January the 6th kind of riots in Washington, D.C. And these movements often see all enemies, including like liberals and the Democratic Party and, gay people, as demonically possessed. Um, Now, I think that's bad news for the psychedelic industry, because what you're seeing in the US is the Christian right becoming more aware of psychedelics and starting to say, well, look, people are having these entity encounters on psychedelics. That sounds like demons to me. So that's bad news for the mainstreaming of of psychedelic medicine, because the Christian right is increasingly starting to see psychedelics as potentially demonic. But I think the increasing obsession with demons is bad news for us more generally, because seeing other humans as potentially demonic or possessed by demons is a surefire way to dehumanize them and to wish them violence. And there have been instances of psychedelic induced violence and even homicide, where people attacked or even killed other people because while they were on psychedelics, they saw someone else as demonically possessed, and they felt they had to kill them. So, on the one hand, I want to help people recover from post-psychedelic psychospiritual crises without imposing my own view of their experiences, but instead working with their preferred interpretive framework. So, if someone feels like they are demonically possessed, like Chloe did, whatever helps them recover. Don't pathologize them, don't freak them out, don't tell them they're crazy. Just, give them support and try to help them recover. Whether they call it a disorder or an energy parasite, similar kinds of tools work to reduce, its power over you. Things like attention, focus, controlling your perspective, cultivating positive beliefs or habits, connecting to others, finding non-judgmental support, and so on. So the same kind of things probably work whether you call it a mental disorder or an energy parasite. Um, in answer to my first question, yes, I think the psychedelic industry and culture should talk more about people's psychedelic entity encounters. But I also think that's a reason why psychedelic medicine might never be widely adopted because most people don't want to encounter entities, and that's quite weird for people. In a wider cultural context, though I am basically though I wrote a book about why we should be open to ecstatic experiences, I am personally wary of the return of what Carl Sagan called a demon haunted world, because I worry that a growing belief in demons is a more violent world. The more people believe in demons, the more likelihood of political and religious violence. But I'm interested to know now what you think. What's your perspective on all these questions? And I'll just mention if you're interested in these kinds of topics and in some of the stories that I've mentioned, you can find out more here at ecstaticintegration.org and you can get 20% off with /Finland. Um, okay, thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Jules. That was an amazing talk and very comprehensive, and it sparked a lot of ideas.
Well, thank
Uh,
you. I'm sorry, I'd never done that talk before, so I wanted to leave an hour for Q&A, and I see that I've been banging on for 90 minutes, but we've got 30 minutes, so.
Great. I didn't want to uh, cut your talk in the middle because it was just so good. So
Oh, thank you.
uh, maybe I'll start with a few questions of my own.
Sure.
Um, for a while, I would come back to the topics of IFS and also the sociological construction of hallucinations, because I think there's an interesting theory that uh, visions or hallucinations are sociologically constructed, so that like expectations have effects on what kind of visions people have. Like you mentioned that those who had an Islamic background had experiences of jinns, for example.
Right.
And when we talk about entities, uh, and people who may then encounter these entities when they ingest psychedelics, this may carry the consequence that such experiences become more common. So, what do you think about this? Because we may have to talk about this, but then also it may make these experiences much more common.
I agree. I run uh, the NGO that I set up. I and my colleagues run a peer support group for people with post-psychedelic difficulties, and people come, and they talk about their difficulties, and sometimes they talk about, they wonder, was I cursed? Because these are people in severe crises. They feel like they're in hell, and they're desperate for an explanation. And they will look at all possible explanations. They will look at is it their nervous system? Is it their brain? Is it trauma? And of course, many of them will also say, was I cursed? or did I pick something up in the ceremony? And when people raise that, I feel a little bit. Uh, I do feel sometimes discomfort because I worry that others in the group will take on that belief, and that it could be unhelpful if everyone goes away going, oh, you know what I mean? I don't want it to be a petri dish for belief in the demonic, but I don't want to pathologize a person, and I want them to feel this is a safe space. Um, so that's a kind of interesting dilemma of itself. Um, but um, but it's important that if people can talk about it and so yes, your great phrase, the socialization of hallucinations. I mean, that's absolutely true. Culture shapes people's um, psychotic experiences. Or another way to put it is culture also shapes our ecstatic experiences. A psychedelic scientist told me recently, he also works in an emergency ward. More and more people have come in with AI related psychoses. They think they've awakened AI. Do you know what I mean? These kinds of things. So this is the latest form that psychotic or ecstatic experiences are taking. Um, so I do think that that's very much a thing in plant medicine culture, in ayahuasca culture. People talk about, spirits are very normal in plant medicine culture, the spirits of different plants and so on. The model of Amazon shamanism, as far as I understand it, is that, if you're unwell or bad things are happening to you, it could very well be that someone has cursed you, or someone has sent a kind of spirit against you, someone sent a magic dart at you or something like that. So I've come across many people um, who who um, who believe it. So certainly it's socialized there. And I can't remember the figure I mentioned earlier, but it's something like 15% of people in the global ayahuasca survey felt they've been uh, harmed by a malevolent spirit during an ayahuasca ceremony. So yes, often socialized. Did that answer? And I mean, so there is a risk in talking about it, um, but that's why I try. I personally think I'm agnostic, as I said right at the beginning, Ansi. Like, I think people who are over certain about these matters, one way or the other, are probably exceeding their authority. Now, I accept if you're a Shipibo shaman, that's your culture. You've been trained in it. But I think, a Westerner who claims to know what's going on in the spirit world is overclaiming. Uh, you know, so so that's why I'm an agnostic about it. Like, I honestly think who knows.
Yeah, great answer. Uh, there are so many questions, but I would like to also leave room for the questions in Q&A, so maybe I'll just pick one of these
Okay,
for
and I'll try and
now.
answer it as quickly and briefly as possible, um, to get through them.
I'll take your time because I also want to hear what you have to think about
Okay.
them.
Hmm.
Um, yeah, I have to. Maybe this is a hybrid between a question and a comment, but if people have these entity encounters in the context of secular psychedelic assisted therapy, what
Uh-huh.
kinds of interpretive frameworks could be offered to make sense of these encounters in a way that can respect different worldviews? Like Jamie Wheal has offered an idea of agnostic gnosticism, that we could perhaps engage with these experiences while maintaining a critical distance from them and resisting inflexible interpretations. And I think that one beneficial possibility offered by such encounters is that it experientially confirms that the world is stranger than we think, and that we may have experiences that our worldview cannot totally explain. But the danger here is, of course, is that we can sometimes be destabilized by such experiences, and we should find ways to help people who suffer from these. And we could learn a lot from people like Chloe that you mentioned.
Yeah. I mean, so people they do have these. I mean, I would love to kind of speak more to people working on clinical trials in this, but they do. I mean, they have. spiritual experiences, and sometimes that involves, you know, a shift to their fundamental worldview. Um, so I mean, here's one thing I would say. Some psychedelic therapists have said because of that, the therapeutic modality in which psychedelic treatments take place should have an openness to the spiritual. That doesn't mean they promote it, but they should be open to discussing it with a client. So, for example, the Embark model, which is of Belser and Brennan, people can find it online. That one of the components of the Embark model is, any spiritual content that should arise, and they talk about not taking any dogmatic metaphysical position on its truth or untruth, but just supporting the client to try and help them make sense of it. This is likewise, Emory University has a whole department and center, which is psychiatry and spiritual chaplains. And so I went to their conference in March, I think it was, where they talked about the potential role of chaplains in psychedelic treatments, in again helping to talk to people about any spiritual content that might arise, including entities. And again, there is a paper that you can find from Emory on the kind of the way they work and their ethics. And again, it's very much about don't impose their own framework, whether that's Christian or shamanic or New Age, but try to meet the client in their framework, try to help them find meaning, try to help them integrate it into their life. You could also think about the work of William James, kind of foundational to, the scientific study of spiritual experiences, including entity experiences. James is a pragmatist. William James talks about let's be pragmatic. How can you make sense of this experience for yourself? Was it helpful to you? Did you meet like a guardian angel or the spirit of your grandfather, and it was really encouraging to you and it helped you to function in your life? Or was this, you know, is this a spirit that just told you horrible things about you, and maybe you shouldn't give it too much attention and find some other way? So of course, that's a bit tricky because you can come across many people in plant medicine culture who said the plants guided me to do this thing, and that might be like to put all my money in crypto, or to leave my family, or the thing that ayahuasca so often tells people is, hey, go and work with ayahuasca, go and be a shaman. I mean, which, as a life choice is probably appropriate for about 0.01% of Westerners. And I sometimes wonder, you know if you're a plant and you have a Darwinian impulse to spread as widely as you can across the world, what a genius evolutionary move to get to that you give people a psychedelic experience where all they talk about is how incredible you are, and they try to, you know what I mean? You're basically kind of turning humans into marketing spam bots for ayahuasca. And what a genius Darwinian move. In other words, maybe ayahuasca is acting in its own interests rather than in your interests. But that's just another topic. But anyway, so the Jamesian pragmatist view can be helpful. Is this a good place to put your attention? Is it helping you function? So those are other possibilities.
Yeah, very interesting perspectives. I hadn't like considered so much about that. What you said about the like plant having an effect on us, so that we would like propagate it in a sense. Because I
And
have had like
apples are tasty
mm,
for their own, that's in the interest of an apple tree to be tasty. And so maybe it's in the interest of psychoactive plants
mm,
uh, to want to propagate. So this is Michael Pollan's perspective, that plants and humans have grown up in a kind of symbiosis, where we are using each other. And sometimes that relationship can become exploitative in one way or the other. And there has to be a kind of rebalancing, like with the coca plant or with the cacao plant. sometimes the relationship gets broken and you have to kind of distance yourself from it.
That is possible, but I must admit that it is really hard for me to be like able to believe in a plant spirit that tells people to buy crypto. That is just like beyond.
That is complex, yeah. But one of the biggest investors in psychedelics is Christian Angermeyer, who founded Atai, big investor in Compass Pathways, and he says that when he discovered psychedelics for the first time is when he first understood crypto, and he's become like one of the biggest crypto investors as well. So, but I agree with you. It would be odd that an Amazon plant would have any interest in cryptocurrency.
Yeah, maybe we'll take a few questions from the Q&A. We have like 10 minutes of time left. So the first question here is that loneliness or feeling unconnected has become one growing mental health problem, especially in the so-called developed world. Could the change from porous self to buffered self be one reason behind it? And could psychedelic experience that include entities reconnect one to the world of entities that then could reduce loneliness or feeling of being alone in the universe?
A really great question. Yeah, that was a lot of my argument in my book, The Art of Losing Control, where I was basically arguing for, in British culture, which is very secular, very non-transcendent, I was saying we should be open to ecstatic experiences as a normal part of human experience and human culture. You don't have to have ecstatic experiences, but we shouldn't pathologize them and stigmatize them, and it shouldn't be taboo. And I talk a lot in the book about the benefits of ecstatic experience. And as the questioner says, one of the benefits is connecting to others, connecting to nature, connecting to the universe, as opposed to feeling atomized. I'm on my own in a dead nature, which is just matter. So, there are some people who are absolutely fine living in a materialist universe, but there are some people who find it kind of uh, atomizing and lonely, and it kind of, undermines their sense of meaning. So it is possible that a kind of neo-animist worldview it's a fascinating worldview in a way. Like, you're living in a universe brimming with sentience, where it's not just humans, there's multiple forms of sentient beings, including other animals that we can engage with. And now perhaps including synthetic forms of consciousness, man-made, AIs. So yes, I think that's a fascinating universe to live in, as long as it doesn't lead to kind of crazy town. It's like Joe Rogan universe, right? And like in the Joe Rogan universe, there's more openness to UFOs, to DMT entities, but also to fascism and Nazis as well. So when you open the Overton window to fringe ideas, you know, and that's what's happening at the moment, is the Overton window is getting open to more fringe ideas like UFOs, like psychedelic entities, but also to, fucking Holocaust deniers. So like that's the less good thing about the mainstreaming of alternative media and alternative ideas and alternative health, is that, you know, some stuff should stay on the fringe.
Yeah, and that can be quite like tight line to balance between like recovering from the disenchantment of the world, but like without completely losing the plot.
Without completely losing the plot. So I think I'm, I thought I was pro the reenchantment of Western culture until I saw what it looked like. And then you're like, oh, so it's that. It's like, you know, charismatic Christians, becoming mainstream and calling Democrats, demonic. Um, that's not, I'm not so into that. The reason that Western culture became moved towards secular liberalism, multiple reasons, but one was the 17th century in Europe. was a century of religious violence. You know, a third of the German population was killed in the wars of religion. And so in the 18th century, people were like, right, we're going to become more secular. We're going to banish some of these ideas of religious ecstasy. We are now in a time of rising political violence. And I think there's, I think in the next 20 years, ecstatic movements and ecstatic cults are going to get caught up in some of that political violence. So we're going to have to go through that as a culture.
Yeah. There's a question in the Q&A. Do you know of research that would compare the efficacy of different interpretive frameworks for dealing with psychedelic-induced difficulties?
Hmm. That's another great question. No. What a good idea for a study. There are hardly any papers on how to recover from post-psychedelic crises. My NGO has published some. So we published a paper called Coming Back Together, and it looked at what people said helped them uh, recover from post-psychedelic difficulties. We did ask people if therapy helped them, but I can't remember. I'm not sure if we had much data on what kind of therapy. Um, uh, so we've published a few papers, um, and people talk about similar kinds of things. They talk about self-care practices like grounding exercises, like meditation. They talk about social support being very important, and sometimes they talk about therapy being important. I think the most popular, the kinds that often people mention are like somatic therapy, Groffian, Jungian, these kinds of things. But that doesn't mean they're definitely more efficacious. They might be just the kinds of modalities that are more popular in psychedelic culture. But that would be a good study to try and refer people to different kinds of therapists. What's complicated as well is often it's less the modality and it's more the bond with the therapist, right? So you might get misleading results because it might just be because a certain therapist is a really warm person or something, you know?
Yeah. Uh, there's one more question or comment that I would like to take. Um, and I want Hannu, so you could speak your thoughts directly if you want to.
Hey, can you hear me?
Yep.
Yes.
Thank you for Jules for the presentation. It was really good. I was thinking while you were uh, telling about your own views that it's important for you to let customers work from their own interpretation framework. And I
Mm,
was thinking I think also like this, and I think it's really hard
mm,
because we learn things and it's so easy. It's safe when we know our framework and it's easy to work from there. And when we meet something that doesn't fit into the framework, we can get easily anxious and a little bit like, if I'm any help for this person or not.
yeah.
And we want to be helpful. And then we start to maybe somehow, maybe consciously, maybe unconsciously push some of these belief systems that we have because it's easy fix. And
Yeah.
I think it should be, we should talk more. I know psychotherapists they get very good training, but there's lots of therapists who get short trainings. I think it would be very important to talk about how to deal with your own anxiety, how to find another ways to bring yourself back to working with customers in other ways than to push your own belief systems so that we can become curious again. So this was more like a comment. Uh,
Yeah.
Maybe I don't have question here, but I think it would be very useful to
Yeah.
also just notice this, and because it's normal human reaction, it's not nothing
Yeah.
to be ashamed of.
Yeah, I think you're right. And I would feel it in myself in a peer support group that kind of my own discomfort if someone would bring in an idea that where I'm worried that it might be harmful, you know. But one thing that people said when we asked people what was helpful or not helpful to them in their recovery, they talked about going to therapists or to specialists or psychiatrists or to spiritual guides as well. And they said that seeing experts was unhelpful as often as it was helpful. And we asked why would it be unhelpful, and they said, well, people said that experts could make one of two errors. They could uh, pathologize or just push a materialist explanation of someone's experiences, like you've just broken your brain and that's it. It's just neurochemical. When that wasn't welcome by the client. The other is they would push a spiritual explanation, like, oh, you need to trust the medicine, which of course is a spiritual idea, or you need to do the work of integration or something like that, when it wasn't welcome. So, to your point, Hanu, it's really about trying to meet the person where they are and hear what they're saying and just kind of suspend your own metaphysical beliefs, and help them find meaning and find recovery. But that's hard, and that's hard for trained therapists. And of course, we're also talking about the world of wellness and of coaching and of healers. I mean, this is very broad. So it's not just therapists with clinical training. It might be like someone who's had a few weeks training from a kind of psychedelic course. And they, when people are new to a topic, they might not want to show their insecurity or their lack of knowledge or expertise, so they can show more certainty than is really warranted as well. So that can happen. So this is a good reason for talking about these things and discussing them and through things like case studies as well. I think that can be helpful. Yeah.
Yeah, that was exactly on point. So thanks for the reply, comment back.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much, Jules, for being our guest today and being so generous with your time and answering all our questions. Are there any concluding words you would like to say before I say a few words about our association?
Yeah, I would like to return to the point of, like, I know that everyone here in the audience will have their own experiences and their own explanatory framework, and I hope what I've said was helpful. And if there are people who tuned into this because they're grappling with some experience that was meaningful or maybe disturbing to them, I hope this talk was helpful. I hope that I didn't come across as alienating, or imposing my own framework. But these are topics that we're all figuring out. No one really has a kind of all the answers on it. So I appreciate the opportunity to discuss it with you all.